Right. Hi, Brian. Nice to meet you.
It's nice to meet you.
Absolutely. Well, I have to start by saying, looking at your CV, I'm completely blown away. You are one of the most prolific academics I've come across. You've published so much, and I think the most intriguing and impressive thing is that you do that across so many different fields. Philosophy, psychology, bioethics, gender studies, medical ethics. I don't know how you do that. But you're quite known for your exploration on the intersection of science and love. And on top of that, you've graduated from three, I think, of the most prestigious universities in the world, Yale, Oxford, and Cambridge. So I'm in awe with the breadth and the depth of your work. Welcome and thank you for coming.
Well, thank you for the very flattering introduction. It's nice to get to talk with you.
Well, they're all true. Anyway, first of all, I want to ask what fascinated me the most is how much you've done. But I mean, why have you chosen to specialize on certain topics? And to me, they all seem to be rather morally charged areas, love, relationships, something very personal. And then you ties it back to something of broader society issues. And you don't seem to be afraid of going into territories. So then let me just start by asking you about your academic journey and what drives you to explore these fields.
It's always a little hard to know why exactly one does the things one does. I mean, I maybe I have a just so story that I tell myself, but um, ever since I was young, I was very interested in moral questions, and I think part of that may have been due to the fact that I was raised in a pretty conservative religious family with very strict rules derived from a sort of biblical understanding of morality.
I see.
And on the one hand, that meant that questions of morality were very salient in my upbringing, and I was always concerned about whether I was doing the right thing or the wrong thing, or whether I would be uh, pleasing to my parents, or upsetting my parents, or pleasing to God, or upsetting God. But at the same time, I developed a skepticism from a young age about a religious way of thinking about moral questions, at least as being sufficient to give the full answer. And often I would find these contradictions in the biblical text that we were reading, or between what the pastor was saying and what seemed intuitively right to me. And so as I started to develop my own moral sense of things and realized that sometimes I would come to a conclusion that was different to whatever it was that we were being taught in church, this really did lead to a bit of a crisis where I thought, well, I need to know what is the basis for right and wrong. And if it isn't just a matter of deriving it from some biblical text, then there's got to be some other grounds for
Yeah.
deciding how we should behave. What does a good life look like? And so pursuing that question, I guess, has been my one of my the main drivers of my life ever since then. When I went to university is the first time I really encountered philosophy as a discipline. And I remember from the earliest days of the course, we were asking questions like, does God exist? And how would we even know? And what is the nature of the good? And how do we tell what's right and wrong? And what's the nature of reality? And so these sorts of questions really fascinated me. And suddenly there was a language that I could use to try to explore them in a rigorous way through this discipline of philosophy. Um, and things have charted an interesting course since then, and I've touched on a whole bunch of different topics. But I think it's that same underlying curiosity and a desire to think rigorously about questions of right and wrong that's been with me for probably most of my life.
Mm. Yes, it started with something so personal and your quest to find truths from for yourself rather than just receiving something that's handed down.
Yeah.
Mm. And I'm also quite aware of your transition from art to philosophy. I think on YouTube we can find clips of you singing. Um,
Yes, that's right.
and I think you had the background in theatre. Do you think your interest of past and endeavors have informed your work today and has given you a unique angle too?
Well, that's interesting. So it wasn't exactly a transition from theater to philosophy in so much as I was doing both in parallel for a long time, and then
Mm.
I eventually had to pick one thing and go with it. So for 10 or so years, I had a professional theater career alongside of going back to school and doing a master's degree and starting to publish in bioethics and these sorts of things. I was doing these things more or less at the same time. And that became exhausting. And so by the time I turned 30, I eventually realized that I just couldn't keep up this dual life trying to, I was living in different countries and I was traveling around doing theater and doing bioethics and so forth, going back to do degrees, trying to keep up with my coursework. And eventually I decided I was going to commit to the academic strand of things. And I started a PhD when I was 30. But I really miss the world of theater and performance. And I sometimes wondered whether these are just two different things I'm interested in. On the one hand, I have these artistic interests, and on the other hand, I'm interested in philosophy and science and so forth. And there's nothing more to be said about it. Other times, I think that maybe they're connected on some deeper level. I think part of what theater is about is exploring the human condition. It does it in a different way than through using propositional logic and citing evidence for certain claims and so forth. You show rather than you tell. You invite the audience to go on a journey with you in a different modality than you would if you were writing a philosophy paper. But a lot of the questions are quite similar, I think. Often you see moral dilemmas play out on stage where part of what's gripping is uncertainty about right and wrong. Often it has to do with the complexity of relationships and so forth. So in some ways, my interest in theater is probably rooted in some similar types of impulses as my interest in philosophy.
Mm. I think it makes a lot of sense. And although you are not sure about how they linked on a deeper level, I'm sure it gives you a more triangulated and dynamic perspective, which comes across in your work.
Well, certainly
And
different communities. I remember when I used to go work in the theater, and the fact that I also had a life in academia was always seen as this curiosity, and vice versa. I'd be at an academic conference and people would hear that I was also an actor, and that would be an interesting point of conversation. But I really, different parts of me come out in those different environments, and I always liked the fact that I wasn't solely confined to one way of relating to people or to the world. That there's these uh, different communities and different kind of ways of being, and I find value in the plurality of ways of going about things.
mm, I encourage more people to do that. I think it helps us explore untapped territories inside of us and holistically make us more whole.
Yeah,
Mm. Well, one of your most, how should I put it, prominent, famous, you're known for your work on love and addiction. And if you're not already sick of talking about it, I would love to go there with you.
sure.
And so previously I did talk to different experts on topics such as love, limerence, mental health, and the crossover. You talk a lot about love and addiction. In your and I yeah, in your view, does love cross the line into addiction? So when does love cross the line into addiction? Or is it actually in itself an addiction? How can we distinguish deep, passionate love versus unhealthy attachment that erodes autonomy and well-being?
Well, unsurprisingly, there are differences of opinion about this.
Yeah,
And partly it has to do with disagreements about what love is. And on the
yeah,
other hand, it has to do with disagreements about what addiction is. Let me just start by talking about addiction. I would say that broadly speaking, there are at least a couple of schools of thought about what addiction is all about. Some neuroscientists have the view that addiction has to do with highly abnormal brain functioning or substances which hijack the brain's reward mechanisms and lead to uh, kind of cravings that are outside the range of what we experience with respect to other normal substances like food or sex or whatever. Other people and some philosophical accounts of addiction uh, lean more in this way, and it suggests that addiction is something that can follow from any rewarding activity that's sort of taken to its extreme. And so that can include food, that can include sex, it can include gambling. And here, both addiction scientists and philosophers tend to agree that gambling can be something that can be addictive, even though it's not really a substance and it doesn't hijack the brain's reward system in quite the same way as, say, certain addictive drugs do. Um, so I would say that, the shared agreement comes with the idea that addiction is something that's harmful. It's something that you'd like to stop, but you can't. And you can't stop despite the fact that it's having bad consequences. So if you accept that addiction is this value-laden concept that requires that it's essentially it's got to be something that's bad for you or for others, maybe your addictions is causing you to harm other people in your environment or whatever, then we can think of how that might map onto to love. Now, love is also very rewarding. And especially, in the early stages of a relationship when you feel infatuated with somebody, certainly the symptoms of being in love are quite similar to the symptoms of some types of addiction, where you go through feelings of much like withdrawal when you can't see the person. You have obsessive thoughts about them. Environments that you spent time with them in have the special salience. So when you're in those environments, you become, totally oriented toward this object of your affection. And And this is where it gets tricky because some people say, well, that just sounds like being in love. That's a totally normal experience. I mean, many people experience that. And it's an even enjoyable, wonderful part of life. And it can be stressful and it can, come along with certain anxiety. But we valorize that kind of experience as we call it, falling in love. And that's supposed to be a good thing. So if addiction is supposed to be something that's harmful on some views, if it's something that's fundamentally bad for you or bad for people around you, and this falling in love, infatuation, crushing on someone type experience is something that we celebrate in society, then how could we even be talking about these in the same way? Um, so, you know, it's hard to know whether we should resolve this debate. I think that there's some truth in the different attitudes that people bring toward this discussion. So one is that this feeling of passionately falling in love with someone has not always been socially celebrated. And when we think of, take the story of Romeo and Juliet, these star-crossed lovers who have this passionate intensity toward one another, that was certainly not looked favorably upon by their families. And if you think about marriages in many societies and historically being the sort of thing that was like an economic institution or a political institution meant to bring people together for pragmatic purposes, falling in love with someone was sort of could potentially be in conflict with that. You might fall in love with quote unquote the wrong person, for example, not the person that your parents or your families wanted to set you up with. So this kind of passionate yearning for somebody is not always seen as a good thing, although it's celebrated in romantic poetry and in contemporary Western culture, it's celebrated. Um, so I guess that shows that whether it's harmful can be kind of contingent on historical and social attitudes.
Mm.
Well, there's more to say, but I don't know. That's just to lay out some of the disagreement
Yeah.
around what love is and what addiction is.
Well, let's hone it in a little bit. Like I said, I've done one episode on this phenomenon called limerence.
Mm.
It's a word that has got a surge of attention on spaces like social media. It's usually framed as a pathological state of obsession. Do you have any thoughts on this trend? Mm, do you think this focus on limerence may risk us pathologizing normal human experience, or do you think it is actually a problem and it does cross over to something more toxic and addictive?
Well, I Googled limerence earlier because I was curious to see what the latest thinking is on this concept. And, various websites that come up suggest that it isn't indicative of a pathology, but rather it's a sort of normal phase that many people go through where they have these obsessive thoughts about a person that they're really interested in. On the other hand, it sounds like in the community forums that you've been looking at, some people really think of it as potentially more pathological, something that we should be worried about. And so I guess, as with many things, there's a range of attitudes about limerence. Some
I
people see it
think
as
very,
normal, some people see it as, pathological or extreme.
yeah, I think from speaking to people who actually struggle with it themselves, very few enjoy it. They don't usually find it something enjoyable.
Yeah. So, I mean, let's say more about what limerence is. Why don't you share your kind of understanding of what limerence basically involves, what it
Ooh.
consists in, and then we'll know we're on the same page.
Ah, okay. Well, I don't actually have an official definition in front of me. I would probably be thinking about people I actually talk to that actually do consulting with me and their experience. I think they feel taken over. They
Hmm.
feel like they have got a loss of identity. They feel that they don't exist unless there is an external mirror, and that usually is a projection. They completely projected the part of their identity onto something outside of themselves.
Hmm.
And so I think the last time I personally experienced it was probably so long ago when I was a teenager. And so my mood becomes completely dependent on, say, how much attention I get from that person and
Hmm.
interaction. It's a very absorbing, compulsive, obsessive quality to it.
Yeah. So I remember in college I had a friend of mine who had an experience very like this, and I remember she was absolutely consumed with her feelings about this one person, and they didn't actually know each other that well, which was kind of interesting. It's often something that happens when you're filling in the gaps of knowledge with someone with these projections. Either you're projecting yourself into the relationship, or you're idealizing the other person. You sort of imagine that your life couldn't be complete without them, and so forth. I think that often people confuse strong feelings with love. And I don't know exactly the cause for that, but when you start to think of love as something that's this intense feeling that you have, almost this desire to possess another person, or you want to be with them all the time, if you start to think that that's what love is all about, then these really intense obsessive thoughts just feel like part of the love story. And I think that's maybe part of how it's portrayed in movies and poetry and love songs and so forth. That this obsession is just part of loving someone. Um, on the other hand, if you think of love as being fundamentally about care and respect, if you think that love is fundamentally about knowing someone and accepting them for who they really are and wanting them to flourish, which is what I think love is,
Mm.
then it's not obvious that that has anything in particular to do with strong feelings. Now, you might come to feel this really strong attachment to a person, but it will ultimately be tempered by this respect for their freedom to develop into the best version of themselves, which may or may not involve having you in their life. So if your starting point is that love is about fundamentally wanting to contribute to the flourishing of another person and to respect them as an end in and of themselves, not as something that's good for you or gives you benefits, then, you know, the question of whether you should possess them or whether you're going to somehow be able to hang on to them, that's a contingent on whether that's conducive to their flourishing. And it might not be. I mean, I'm not the best person for every other person, but I might be, I might be really a good contributor to the flourishing of somebody's life. But if I'm not, maybe we shouldn't be together and vice
Mm.
versa.
Mm.
So I think, this feeling of, I can't function without this person. I can't think about anybody but them. Often when we have these thoughts, we don't really even know the person that well. And often we are idealizing them. And then it all comes crashing down months later when we have a real conversation or we try living together or we find out that our values aren't actually in line or whatever. So, there can be something I think that some people find thrilling about these having a crush on someone. Maybe that's, just part of growing up and hormones and being a teenager. And maybe there's nothing to criticize about it necessarily, although it can be quite uh, intense and sometimes destructively so, at least on a small scale. Um, but I think if we confuse that for love and we think that love is about the intensity of our feeling for someone, that can lead us into trouble. And that can get us to think that, for example, really possessive jealousy is just a sign of how much we love the person, or trying to control someone is just a sign of how much we love the person. And you start
Mm.
to see that in relationships that are characteristically abusive, where, you know, um, the strength of the feeling, even though it manifests as jealousy and controlling and ownership and these kinds of things, if people think that that's what love is, then they don't notice how much of an assault on the other person's autonomy it is, and
Mm.
it gets excused and treated as though it's a good thing when probably it isn't.
I think in the end, we get your definition of love, which is something beyond just owning and possession. It's about evolving together, it sounds almost like.
Yeah, I
Or,
mean,
yeah.
there's how people talk about love is something that changes over time, and different cultures use the word differently and use it to refer to different types of things. There's scientific theories of love, there's philosophical theories of love. So I guess I'm giving you one philosophical theory of love that's a normative theory, meaning that it has sort of values built into it. It's not just describing how people use the word, it's saying this is how we should use the word. And I'm just sympathetic to views like this. So I'm inspired by some views like Bell Hooks is a Black
Mm.
feminist author who has a very prescriptive view of love according to which it's incompatible with certain types of abuse. And and therefore, when people say, well, these cliches of he only hits me because he loves me or something like that, what that reflects is this normalization of abuse, where we sort of think that the strong feeling is just enough. And as long as the person really, really wants you, then, maybe you excuse certain types of misbehavior. But I agree with Hooks, and I agree with some other philosophers who say that we should advocate for a view of love according to which it's something that is rooted fundamentally in care and respect. And that can be love of friends. I mean, I think friendship is essentially rooted around care. It can be love of a romantic partner, love of family. When we use love in this normative sense, we're referring to something that is intrinsically good because it's rooted around care and respect of the other person, which are, some of the deepest human values that we can and should foster.
Mm, mm. Do you believe a history of trauma, especially childhood trauma, makes someone more prone to love addiction or patterns of unhealthy attachment?
So I'm not a clinical psychologist, and I don't have expertise in the literature on trauma.
Doesn't matter,
I'm
just your perspective.
reasonably familiar with the literature on attachment, and my understanding is that trauma can certainly affect patterns of attachment or styles of attachment. So early experiences of childhood trauma make secure attachment less likely and make anxious or fearful and avoidant attachment more
Mm,
likely.
mm,
Um, and attachment is definitely related to how we think of love as well. So when you try to approach love from a scientific perspective, people will often draw on attachment theory as a reasonably well supported body of scientific literature that can make sense of the variance in certain types of human relationships. Um, and so it seems to provide a good grounding for understanding different relationship types and the kind of love that you develop with a person if you have a secure attachment to them qualitatively and in terms of the causes and consequences is going to be quite different from the sort of love that you develop with a person if you're constantly anxiously attached or if you're, even avoidantly attached and you don't even really want to get into certain types of intimate relationships because you're trying to protect yourself, for example. So, yeah, I think attachment can be influenced by trauma and it can also affect the type of love that we can build with someone.
So, can love addiction ever be a good thing?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we can find value and meaning in extreme experiences. And I think that even when things are sort of harmful or unhealthy in some view, they can still be meaningful. Um, I think that if you define love addiction as something that's harmful, then if it's all things considered harmful, then I guess it isn't good by definition. Or at least it's not, if good and harmful are opposites. Um, I guess something can be harmful but ultimately beneficial. So if you undergo a very harmful experience, but you learn from it, for example, or you grow from it, or you find how to be a better person or how to relate to others better, then it can be that it was instrumentally valuable to developing a better life. But you know, like you know, addiction is a complicated thing. There's some people who have written, Owen Flanagan is somebody who's written about addiction as something that can be part of one's identity, their sense of self, and so that if your way of being in the world is so characterized by a certain relationship to various substances, for example, and then you cure yourself of this addiction, you almost change who you are. And that can be very alienating and it can have existential implications if you don't recognize yourself anymore. Maybe you have to reinvent yourself from scratch. Who am I as a non-addicted person? So, can it ever be a good thing? I mean, I think that people can have experiences that they characterize as love that have signs of obsessiveness or possessiveness or something like addiction, depending on which theory of addiction you draw on, that can be very harmful and destructive in certain ways that can lead to great pain and suffering and sorrow,
Mhm.
that nevertheless can be part of a life well lived. I guess I'll say it that way.
Mm.
Now, if all one ever experiences is this sort of extreme relational pattern and they never have the experience of a sort of stable, calm, healthy, comforting, sustainable, loving relationship with another person, that strikes me as regrettable. But I wouldn't say that, you know, the sort of thing we're talking about is incompatible with living a good life, all things considered.
Mm. Incompatible with living a good life. Tell us about your book, Love Drugs. Um, what's its thesis and why is it getting so much attention?
Well, that's very interesting. So the origins of that book are are very accidental. Many years ago, I met my co-author on that book, Julian Savulescu, who at the time was the chair of practical ethics at the University of Oxford, and I was a master's student at the time. I was studying experimental psychology at Oxford at that time, and through a series of events, he ended up hiring me to work as basically a research assistant on this book project with him to explore the ethics of enhancement in relation to relationships. So maybe I should say what that means. There's this big debate in bioethics about using medical technologies to improve various facets of human functioning beyond what's necessary for treatment. So, for example, if I have attention deficit disorder, maybe I take a certain drug that helps me concentrate in a way that's considered normal. But if I have normal concentration abilities and then I take a drug that enhances my cognitive faculties in some way beyond what's necessary for normal functioning, then this is considered a type of enhancement. I'm going beyond what's necessary for treatment. Now, there's debates about whether, in fact, these drugs have these effects. Many people are sort of skeptical about whether our cognition is really all that improved if we take these drugs and we haven't been diagnosed with a disorder. Maybe a more obvious example would be doping in sports. This is where we have a set of interventions, exercise and diet and so forth that we think are appropriate. But if you use certain biotechnologies to enhance your performance beyond, in this case, what's allowed, then not only is it seen as a type of enhancement, it's also seen as a form of cheating. So a bunch of ethical debates come up around that. But most of this discussion for many, many years focused on ways that I might use technologies to increase my own capacities, to try to make me smarter or stronger or uh, whatever it might be compared to some baseline. And Professor Savulescu, along with our mutual colleague Anders Sandberg, wrote a paper many, many years ago where they had the idea to extend this into relationships. So what if we could use biotechnologies to somehow improve our relationships, not just individual capacities, but our capacity to love well? And so they wrote this very speculative paper, I think around 2011 or so. And then I was brought onto this project to try to turn this into a book. But I really hadn't thought about it before that point. It was not something that I'd studied particularly all that much. Um, but I dove into the project and tried to read everything I could to do a good job on this thing I'd been entrusted with. And so I read deeply into the evolutionary psychology of mating, the history of marriage, biopharmacology, and uh, all the different kind of tools that people use to try to alter their brain chemistry in ways that seem like they'll have implications for relationships. So that got me learning about the use of MDMA or ecstasy in the 1980s as an aid to couples counseling. So this very strong mind-altering substance that was explicitly used to try to help some people improve their relationships, partly through resolving traumas that were impairing their relationships. And tried to bring all this together into one volume, which mostly came about through a series of writing papers and getting critical commentaries from other people in the field, and then trying to respond to those objections by coming up with a better argument and then putting it all together into a book. So it was really a long process. It was like 6, 7, 8 years of writing papers, getting feedback, tinkering with the arguments, and then putting it finally together into one volume that came out a few years ago, right as people were starting to pay more attention to this so-called psychedelic renaissance,
Mm.
including MDMA-assisted therapies. And I think that's part of why people are paying attention to it.
Yes, I think what people are drawn to is the idea of just taking a drug to forget about the pain. And this one is particularly about the pain of love, but I think the idea of that you can just take a pill and all the pain will go away is very attractive to most. It's a bit like that film, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. The question might be, should we not do that? But then that ties into the whole bigger question of, oh, should we take antidepressants, which some people do believe that we should grieve naturally. Do you so the broader question to you would be, do you think modern technology, medical technology, sometimes risk taking away our humanity?
Well, there's a lot there. So if you say it risks taking away our humanity, we have to agree on what it means to be a human.
Hmm.
and whether, being a human in that way is necessarily a good thing. Maybe our humanness is limited in certain ways that we want to try to transcend or to improve upon. So let me set aside the question of humanity and just focus on the question of whether it's good or bad to treat grief that's associated with, say, a breakup or the loss of love or something
Yes,
like that.
let's do that.
A similar type of question has to do with if somebody you love dies and you're grieving over their death, should you start taking antidepressants at some point? A lot of people have debated this particular question. So maybe I'll start with that, and then we can kind of expand it to the case of love and breakups and things like that.
Yes.
Um, so it's quite normal and natural for human beings to grieve after someone that they're close to dies. And that's also seems to be true of some other species as well, where if a close attachment partner in some other species dies, you'll see behavior that looks a lot like grief in the surviving partner. Now, it's also true that there are drugs available, and SSRIs are one of them, that can, for some people, sort of block those feelings or make less severe those feelings of sadness and loss, and seem to enable them to sort of get along and go back to work and so forth. But many people find that there's something unseemly about that. In other words, we think, well, you should grieve when someone you love dies, and it should be painful because that's that shows in some way that you really loved them when they were alive. And so if you want to just take some pill to short circuit that process and then you move right on with your life, it's in some way disrespectful toward the relationship that you had with that person. Um, or if we take the example of a romantic breakup, suppose you had a really complicated relationship with this person and it breaks up and you're grieving, and maybe that grief offers you an opportunity to reflect on the relationship or what happened or why it had to end or what you contributed to that or what you can learn from that. And if you take some pill that, again, cuts short that process of reflection and the ability to just sit with those feelings for a while, yeah, it seems like we're depriving ourselves of the opportunity to potentially learn from what happened, which might mean that we then charge right into another relationship that's, potentially just as toxic as the last one, for example, because we didn't stop to actually deal with what we had experienced initially. So it seems like there's definitely some situations where it would have been good for us to sit and grieve, but we didn't like the sort of negative feelings, and so we took a drug to short circuit that. That seems objectionable.
Mhm.
But there's also cases where it seems like there's this phrase that I remember from the bioethicist Eric Perrins, where he says sometimes pain just crushes human souls. And there's nothing particularly good that's going to come from more grieving. And so somewhere you have to draw a line between where the grief is ultimately part of a meaningful life or life well lived or something you can learn from, and where you just have, months and months of debilitating grief and you can't get out of bed and you're not participating in life and you're not forming other relationships and you're, you know, um, falling short of your responsibilities. Maybe you're not taking care of your children, you're letting your friends down at work and so forth. It seems like there's got to be some point where it would be reasonable to make the judgment that if a medical technology could help you get back on your feet and participate in life a little bit more without sacrificing the chance to learn from what happened and so forth, that surely there's some point where it would be prudent to take the medication if it would help you with that. So, in the book, we talk about this and we say there's no universal line that can be drawn in the sands of human suffering. People have to determine for themselves where that line is. And there's some extreme cases of prolonged depression that seem like some form of treatment, whether that's medication based or some other type of treatment, is certainly warranted. And there are other times where we're just trying to avoid dealing with problematic feelings, and so we turn to medication as a shortcut. And so it's important to try to distinguish between those two potential uses of medication.
Hmm. Do you lean one way or the other?
Well, one thing that's interesting is the medical community has to actually draw specific lines about this because if you prescribe medication to someone, it has to be because it's treating a medical condition.
Hmm.
And so they have to have some criteria where they say, now it's appropriate for me to write a prescription for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And we could have a whole conversation about SSRIs. It's a very complicated class of drugs that,
I would love
um,
to.
yeah. So, yeah, maybe we will talk about that. Um, you know, it used to be that there was uh, some duration of grieving after somebody died that the medical community decided they would count as normal. And then if it persisted past that, and I don't remember what it was like past a year, past 6 months or something like that, then they would consider it to be pathological, unnormal in some negative way, and therefore a candidate for treatment. And then they updated their diagnostic criteria and just sort of shifted the line back by a couple of months. And it's just completely arbitrary. Like there's no scientific literature suggesting that some period of time is the right amount of time to grieve. It's just that they saw that these drugs could be helpful for some people who were suffering from certain types of grief after the loss of a loved one, and felt that it was no longer benefiting them in some way, and felt that it was not any longer part of a life well lived, but was just really dragging them down. And so they sort of changed the diagnostic criteria. So I guess I would say that, you know, I think there's a certain amount of arbitrariness in coming up with a policy about when people should have access to drugs for purposes of treating what might look like ordinary life experiences like grief or mourning. Um, and a lot of that just follows from the model we have, which is that if you make biomedical technologies available to people, we have to think of them as medicine, and medicine has to be treating a disease or a disorder. And so then we'll come up with arbitrary criteria for what we think counts as a disease or disorder to make the drugs available. But one thing we argue in the book is that we shouldn't be thinking in those terms. We should think about when is it likely to be helpful to a person to have access to a biomedical technology? When can it help make their life better? And when is it likely to be harmful to a person? And that might not always track what we think of as underlying disease states. And so partly what we try to do in the book is just open up the conceptual toolkit to help people think about when and why is it a good thing to take a substance uh, towards some end, and when and why should we try to avoid that? And then once we've got that straight, we can figure out what the policy should be in terms of drawing uh, lines in the sand.
Thank you. Let's shift. Either we continue and talk about SSRI, but there's another big topic that I want to talk about, and I'm aware of time: monogamy and relationship norms.
Mhm.
In one of your many articles, you critique the automatic assumption that monogamy is a social norm. This is something I am increasingly intrigued by. I do work with a lot of people who don't want to subscribe to that, and it's not necessarily wrong or fundamentally wrong. Do you why do you think monogamy has been so deeply entrenched in Western societies and in many places not, well, colonialism and stuff plays into it, but we won't go there. What would make it to shift the cultural default to a more open and reflective approach, if that's what you think is better? What do you think about it? The norm itself, why is it there? Is it a good thing? I know it's not binary like that, but what do you think of it in general?
Well, there's different theories about how monogamous marriage became the default expectation within Western societies as the ideal to which everyone should be striving. I was recently rereading Friedrich Engels on this, of Marx's collaborator, and he has this famous essay about his view of the origins of monogamy having to do with the rise of capitalism and its relationship to patriarchy, whereby monogamous marriages are essentially an instrument that men use to ensure their paternity, and so that they can pass down their inheritance and their private property to their male heirs. And so if you have a patriarchal capitalist society, it's in the interest of men to ensure sexual exclusivity, at least of their wives. And then often these other mechanisms would be in place for men to also have sexual relationships outside of the marriage, often through prostitution or affairs, while still stigmatizing women's extramarital sexual activity. And so the idea is that there's this hypocritical form of monogamy that's a form of control over women's sexual freedom to ensure that any children within a marriage are definitely those of the father, so that the inheritance could be passed down to the legitimate heir. That's Engels's view of the origins of monogamy. Um, Now, there's there's more symmetrical forms of monogamy. If there are two people who really believe that they would like to um, engage exclusively with one another in terms of sexuality or certain forms of emotional intimacy, sometimes is included in monogamy. And they both sort of willingly agree to that with the idea that it's something that will help both of them have a better life. I don't see that there's anything wrong with that. Um, but often what happens is that people don't really talk about what their goal is for the relationship. There's this background assumption maybe that the goal should be that we'll end up in a monogamous relationship where we forsake all others and have uh, uh, only sexual activity within this relationship. But people don't really talk about it and they don't confirm that that's actually what they want or what's best for them or what's best for both of them. And so sometimes what we have is people drift into something that's this expectation of monogamy, but then they discover that that's not what they want or it's not what their partner wants. But there's so much shame and they can't really talk about it. And so you end up getting people cheating on each other, and then there's lies and deception and so forth. And this can be very destructive to relationships. So a modest view is just that when people are getting into a relationship, it would be good for them to discuss explicitly what kind of relationship they think that they're getting into, just so that there's, um, mutual understanding. Um, and I don't think it's a one size fits all thing. I think, some people are oriented toward uh, having one main partner with whom they share a bunch of experiences and have an exclusive sexual relationship. And I think for some people that could be consistent with their flourishing. There are other people who there's various measures in psychology, and there's one of them assesses something called sociosexuality. There are people who score very high on this measure of sociosexuality, and it just suggests that they're sort of more intrinsically oriented toward a desire to have more than one sexual partner or to be romantically involved with more than one person. And it might be that for people who are sort of oriented that way, finding a community within which they can practice a non-monogamous relationship in an ethical way would be best for them and for their partners if they're similarly oriented. So it's kind of a boring answer. It's that, you know, people should try to engage in the relationships which really are best for them. And I don't think we should assume that a monogamous relationship is necessarily best for everyone. And I think it would make sense to have a culture where we could make room for different types and ways of pursuing relationships so that people could find out what's the relationship that works best for them. Now, it isn't an exactly perfect analogy, but just think of the fact that some people are gay in the sense that they're intrinsically oriented and attracted toward people of the same sex or gender. Other people are not. And it seems like we've made some progress to opening up the cultural script for what counts as a legitimate relationship to make it so that people who are strongly and intrinsically oriented toward same-sex attraction can form loving relationships with people to whom they're attracted. Similarly, in the same way that people vary in their sexual orientation, people vary in their relational orientation, in whether they'd be more likely to be happy in a monogamous relationship or a non-monogamous relationship. But because the culture is so hegemonically focused around monogamous relationships, and that's held up as the ideal, we don't really have a lot of examples in the culture of what a healthy, ethical, non-monogamous relationship would even look like. And so it's very, very much harder for people who find that that's how they're oriented to even know how to proceed or how to talk about it or how to share their desires with other people or how to find communities within which those kinds of desires are seen as okay rather than as simply a failure to be monogamous, which is how I think polyamory and other types of non-monogamous relationships are still commonly seen in some discourses.
Hermeneutic injustice, isn't it? That you don't even have the word to express your desire because it's so not named and not discussed in the world. You
It's
find that
starting to change a little bit. You're starting to see some depictions in TV and movies of non-monogamous relationships, but just think of like growing up when you're a child and the songs you listen to on the radio,
mm,
like love songs. They're they're pretty much always, first of all, assuming a heterosexual relationship between a man and a woman that is based around this idea of jealousy, possessiveness. I only want you. I can only live with you. Why are you looking at that other guy? There's always this assumption that the type of relationship that's being valorized here is a exclusive, possessive, monogamous relationship between a man and a woman, basically. And so if you're growing up as a little child and you're starting to get crushes on people and figure out, what your relationship values are, if all you're ever exposed to is this idea that there's one type of relationship that's the ideal, and you don't even see movies of, I don't know, polyamorous couples having healthy relationships. They just don't exist. I
Yeah.
mean, maybe there are one or two or some TV shows that start to explore this.
Fake love, I think, when I was younger.
Yeah, and
Mormons.
so you have to see examples of what it looks like because we all have to learn the norms and rules of how to relate to other people. It isn't something we're just born with. We have to understand what does a healthy relationship look like in this culture, in this time, under these circumstances. So that's something that we have to acquire. And partly how we acquire the norms of our culture is through pop culture and through media and literature and storytelling and so forth. So if the storytelling of our culture exclusively shows us one type of relationship, and we don't even see that a type of relationship that we might be well suited to, I mean, and here the analogy is again clear. If you're a gay person growing up in a small town and all you ever see is kind of propaganda for heterosexual relationships, and you never see anybody celebrating a healthy gay relationship anywhere, it's quite hard to even admit to yourself what your feelings are, to know who you can talk to share to even imagine what a good relationship would look like in your mind because it's not available in the culture. And so, I think something similar is true, although it's changing. You're starting to see a little bit more cultural representation of non-monogamous relationships that are other than just cheating and adultery and the kind of forms that are based around deceit and disrespect.
Yeah, because I was going to ask you how would people know if they're curious about it, and now you told me there's actually a test they can do.
Yeah, so you can probably Google it, but anyway, sociosexuality is the trait that I'm thinking of, and there are various ways of assessing a person's orientation in
Mm,
respect of this trait.
interesting. Yeah, so we've talked about how pe most people endorse monogamy and reflectively. And you said something about it being based on the questionable assumption of it being a zero-sum game. Can you say a bit more about that? And if we get quite practical here, if someone is doubting the way they run their own relationship and wondering, what steps can they take to critically look into their beliefs and make more intentional choices?
Yeah, so I think the zero-sum game view suggests that, if I have a partner whom I love and who I'm sexually attracted to, and then it becomes clear that I am also attracted to somebody else, or I might even want to form a loving relationship with someone else. Currently, many people think, well, either that means you don't love the first person enough, or you don't love them fully, or that means that your love will somehow be divided. Now, it's true that your time is divided. We can only have so much time to spend with people, but that's something we're quite used to in the realm of friendships. So I'll just sort of dwell on this example for a second. Suppose you have a best friend whom you really love dearly, and love is the right word to describe it. Maybe you don't have an intimate sexual relationship with them, but you passionately love this dear friend of yours. And then, through some other context, through work or through some social activity, you come to get to know some other person who also becomes a friend over time and supposed to become a really, really dear friend. I think many of us are familiar with the experience of having multiple very close friends, people that we love dearly, whom we trust, who we confide in. And, these people are different. Maybe they know each other, maybe we're part of a friend group, but maybe we know them from different walks of life or different periods of life, or when we lived in a different town or had a different job or something like that. And in those cases, most people, I think, can see that it's certainly possible to love more than one person. Or take the example of having children. You have your first child, you love them more than anything in the world. Then you have your second child. It's not like you now love your first child less because you have come to love the second child. So this is just to push back against the idea that love is a zero-sum game. We're certainly capable of having deep love for more than one person, as in the case of when we have more than one child, as in the case of when we have more than one dear friend. And so people who advocate for this view with respect to romantic relationships just suggest that there's nothing fundamentally different about having a loving relationship with more than one person to whom we also have a sexual attraction or a desire to engage in certain types of intimate or romantic behaviors. But the kind of monogamous discourse has presented this different view, which is that sure, maybe we can have more than one friend, but when it comes to this one special kind of relationship, the romantic relationship, that really has to be about one person and there can't be anybody else. And so that that sort of view is so drummed into our heads from a very young age that many people draw this categorical distinction. They see romantic relationships over here on the one hand, there can only be one. Friendships, relationships with children and so forth. Sure, there can be more than one. And the people who would advocate for at least the ability of polyamorous relationships to be functioning and positive just would suggest for a weaker distinction there, that there's no fundamental distinction between the way we relate to our friends as to the way we could relate to romantic partners.
Mm. There's so much social pressure to not get outside of the norm, though. Do you have any suggestion for people who are itching to get out of the system but are facing so much institutional, social, family pressure?
Well, it's very difficult. I think the internet has made it easier.
Mm.
People can now gain access to resources where you can see whole communities of people who are trying to articulate what an ethical and a good life would look like other than in the form of a monogamous lifelong relationship with one person. Um, and that helps, I think. If you feel like you're alone with your thoughts and desires and anybody you talk to treats you as though you're a freak, that's very psychologically painful and isolating, and it can make it very hard to feel like you can build a life that feels authentic to you. So you just end up cutting yourself off from your own desires or something like that. But if you can at least see how there are other people who seem to be managing their lives in a reasonably healthy and successful way, who share your views or your values, or seem to have similar types of desires or orientations to you, then I think for many people that can be very helpful. But there's no doubt that, especially in more conservative parts of the world. I mean, if you're living in San Francisco or something like that, you're not going to find any difficulty finding plenty of
Yeah.
polyamorous people who you can talk to and who will understand your way of life. But if
Mm.
you're in a conservative town or a conservative profession or a conservative country, it continues to be a major challenge for people who would want to publicly be anything other than monogamous, because the social stigma is still quite severe.
Mm. I hear you. Thank you for giving us a different perspective.
Sure.
Actually, on that subject, do you think, because you also talk about pretty controversial subjects, cultural practices, bodily autonomy, circumcision being one of the prominent examples, we can go there.
Sure.
And how do you think cultural norms around moral values like duty, loyalty, sacrificing interact with our deeply personal, authentic experience?
Yeah. So, you mentioned the example of circumcision. It's a cultural practice I've written critically about. And the main practice I criticize is the secular American practice, where it's just sort of done routinely in hospitals. So basically, this is for those who don't know or who don't grow up in the United States. The U.S. is the only modern country that, for non-religious reasons, practices this routine circumcision of boys. So boys are born, and then a few days after birth, they have a surgery performed in their penis to remove about a third of the skin system of the penis, which is called the foreskin. And there's an interesting history as to why this became a cultural norm in the United States. And for a brief time, it was also normative to some extent in England, which is where the US got the practice, and in Canada and Australia and New Zealand. So it was part of the Anglophone world that had this practice of circumcision. But it fell out of favor in those other countries. At least by the 1980s, rates were pretty low and they remain low. And it's only the United States that's kept this as a majority custom. You have some countries where it's a religious practice, like in Israel, there's a majority birth custom of circumcision, but it's explicitly an ethno-religious thing having to do with Judaism. So what I mostly criticize is not the religious practice of circumcision, but this sort of quasi-medicalized cultural custom that doesn't particularly have any deep spiritual meaning for anybody. It's just done out of habit, and I argue that it's a bad habit. It's something that we should be very critical of because I think people have a right to their bodies. And so, if someone's going to remove a part of my body, either they have to have my consent or there has to be a medical emergency. Like I'm going to die if they don't do it. But if the idea is that it's okay to just routinely remove parts of people's genitals because they're boys in our culture, so we don't routinely remove parts of girls' genitals in the United States, although some cultures do. Um, that seems to me to cut against the deepest moral commitments we have as a society, which is that we ought to have some sovereignty over our own embodiment. And this has to do with deep views we have around sexual assault, for example. We think that even touching somebody's sexual anatomy without their consent can be a gross violation of their right to make certain decisions for themselves. So if we think that it's okay to also just cut off part of a person's body when they're not even in a position to defend themselves, we better have a very good reason. And the reasons that are given in the United States are not good reasons. They're like, oh, well, maybe it's cleaner or something like that, as though boys can't wash their genitals. Or, oh, maybe it'll reduce the risk of a urinary tract infection, as though girls don't get UTIs 8 to 10 times more frequently than boys do. And what do we do if you get a UTI? You treat it. You don't perform genital surgery.
Mm.
So the excuses in US culture are so pale in comparison to what would be required to morally justify non-consensually cutting off part of somebody's body. That's my view. Now, what do you do when it comes to the religious case, where it actually is deeply embedded within, you know, people's spiritual values and their sense of connection to their ancestors and so forth? And this is not the like 99% of circumcisions in the U.S. don't fit this description. But if you're talking about circumcision within Judaism or in some Muslim cultures, where it's seen as part of the religious identity of the community, then at the very least the conversation gets morally complicated. It's not, in my view, it's not complicated in the American sense. It's very wrong to perform circumcision on a newborn child for trivial reasons to do with your conception of cultural normality or hygiene or something like that. So I would be very happy to talk about that, and that's where I actually spend most of my time making my arguments, because
Mm.
it's this major moral wrong that's very widespread and that's highly normalized in American culture. So people don't even realize that it's wrong. So that's why I've
Mm.
kind of been chomping at this bit for so many years. The religious case is difficult. I think the same reasons apply. I think that even within religious communities, even within Judaism, for example, there are strong traditions of respect for the body and not violating the integrity of the body. And then there's this one big carve out for circumcision because it's seen as God's will. And basically, if that's what God commands, then it's up to God whether boys get to keep that part of their body. But otherwise, actually, Judaism is very negative on body modification and piercing and tattooing and so forth, with this idea that there's something sacred about the intactness of the body. So I think that even within religious traditions, I was talking to a Turkish colleague the other day who's describing the laws in Turkey, where there's a Muslim tradition of circumcision, again for boys and not for girls. And there, it's the rates are very high. It must be over 95% of boys are circumcised in Turkey. But when you look at the law with respect to bodily integrity, it presents the same tension here. It talks about, you know, surgeries must only be performed when medically necessary, and autonomy and consent are seen as core values within Turkish society. So it's not like there's some unrecognizable alternative moral universe in Turkey where somehow bodily integrity doesn't count. It's like people have a sense that people have a right to their bodies. But then there's this big exception when it comes to certain rituals, and particularly in the case of circumcision for boys, it's that, yeah, everybody has a right to their bodies except for this part of their penis when they're not in a position to defend themselves against this. So it's typically done to children who don't really have an ability to say no. And so there's a tension even within cultures that practice
Mm.
circumcision, where it's often something that's morally debated within those communities. And I'm not Jewish and I'm not Muslim, and so I don't have a prescription for how Jews and Muslims should conduct their cultural practices. But I do have Jewish and Muslim friends who are critical of circumcision, and I'm proud of the efforts that they take within their own communities to try to, you know, bring to light these alternative values about bodily sovereignty and to argue that there are resources within these religious communities that can recognize those values and question whether certain practices definitely have to continue in the way that they have in the past. So, there's a interesting movement among some Jews and some Muslims to try to criticize these practices, even though they're longstanding and even though they're given great cultural weight within those communities.
Assuming someone is also taking a critical view and feeling quite angry and upset about this, is there anything they can do today?
Well, it's a similar thing. As I said before, you have to go on the internet and find that you're not alone.
Yeah.
And actually, this was a big deal. So in the United States, the rates of circumcision until around the time I was born in the 1980s were very high. They were like over 80%. And in the UK, they were also reasonably high, although they never got that high. And people have to realize that circumcision, because it's a surgery, it carries risks. And so even if the absolute risk is relatively low of something really bad happening, if you perform 1 million circumcisions a year, which is at least in the US, there's at least 1 million a year, some proportion of those are going to involve very serious problems, like removing too much skin so that you can't accommodate an erection later in life, gouging out part of the head of the penis, causing nerve damage. There's all sorts of issues that can arise, even if they aren't quote unquote very common. And so what you'll find is that then, there are quite a few men who have, serious problems. Then there are others who just learn that circumcision isn't normal in other countries. Like they go to Europe or something and they find out, oh, this isn't done here. And then they do some research and they go, wait, why is it done in the US? And European doctors don't think this is healthy or necessary. And so they have this change of perspective. And then they actually feel quite upset, like you suggest, where they say, wait, some like literally a doctor, someone whose job is to protect my health and well-being, somehow was authorized by my parents to cut off part of the most private part of my body. I mean, pretty much every culture teaches that the genitals are private and intimate without my consent. And now I'm just permanently missing this part of my genitals.
Mm.
And some people shrug that off, but other people that becomes like an obsessive preoccupation. They feel so violated by what happened that they can hardly think of something else. And up into the 1980s, before people had common access to the internet, this was often just a privately experienced inner tragedy that many men had. But there began to be chat groups and online movements and things starting to form. And so I think that for many people who have this experience, it's now at least they know they're not alone. They know that there are many people who feel quite upset about what happened. And for some of them, it continues to be a tragedy. For others of them, they try to harness that feeling of grief and loss into trying to change the practice for the next generation. So they engage in activist activities to try to um, raise consciousness about reasons not to perform the surgery. And so that's one way that I know that some men have tried to deal with this is to try to, you know, deal with their own grief as best as they can, but then to try to advocate for changes so that the next generation of children can be spared.
And I guess that's how we can channel a lot of things we feel passionate about. Although it might be too late for ourselves, we do things to help the next generation.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Mm. Now, final topic, perhaps science and philosophy. And I'm not sure about Okay, let me ask you a very broad question and you can take it wherever you go. What's your
That's
thoughts on AI? Because obviously that's the thing that's changing things very rapidly now in 2025. Um, I don't know. There's so much about the ineffable, mysterious aspects of human experience in literature, philosophy, and theater. I know you don't see them as dichotomies, but somehow science is influencing how we experience and understand emotions and relationships too. And particularly AI. AI is not science, but anyway, I'm throwing a lot out there. But final topic, you take it wherever you want.
yeah. So I mean, I don't see science and creativity as being dichotomous, as you mentioned, and that's
Yeah.
certainly manifested in my own life, having been an actor for a long time and also being a cognitive scientist professionally. There's this old quote that comes from Richard Feynman, who's a physicist. I don't remember where it comes from exactly, but he tells the story of this poet friend of his who says, I as a poet can really appreciate the beauty of a flower, but you as a physicist, you just use your scientific mind and you tear it apart and you break it down into these, molecules and you can't appreciate the beauty of a flower. And Feynman says, look, I may not be a poet, but just as a person, I think I can appreciate the beauty of a flower just like you do. I look at it and I'm beholden with certain feelings and so forth. But he says, as a scientist, I can just relate to the flower in more ways. I have more conceptual tools to try to see it at a different level. I have a theory about why it is that the flower probably also is beautiful to bees, for example, because bees are drawn to flowers. Maybe bees have an aesthetic sense, for example, that's developed through evolutionary processes that makes it so that flowers are aesthetically appealing to them in a way that then causes them to, engage in the process of pollination and so forth. And so I think science can give us conceptual tools to look at the world in different ways. And then we find now different dimensions along which we might find something of beauty or value or worth writing about. some of the romantic poets were very interested in science and would attend scientific lectures and so forth and write about the latest findings. So I really don't see any contradiction at all between, having an aesthetic appreciation of the world and also being motivated to learn about it scientifically. Um, with respect to AI, I have lots of thoughts. I've been writing a bunch of papers about AI with colleagues lately.
Okay.
And yeah, I mean, so soon after ChatGPT came out, my housemate, Sebastian Parz-Daman, who's also a philosopher and a bioethicist, and he and I were living together at the time, and decided to run some experiments where we took a model, a sort of base model from ChatGPT, and then we fine-tuned it on our own past publications.
Ah,
So we basically created a little digital twin of our scholarly selves. And then,
no.
yeah, so this was really Seb's idea. I have to hand it to him. And the way you do it basically is you put in the title and the abstract of a paper you've written, and then as the prompt, and then as the completion, you put in the rest of the paper. And so in my case, I have more than 100 papers. I don't remember how many we used to train the model, but what you do is over time, the model then learns the relationship between an abstract expression of an idea as you articulate it, and then how you would flesh out that idea in concrete detail over the length of an essay. And so the final step then is once you've trained the model to learn that, you can put in the title and the abstract of a new paper that you haven't yet written. Uh, I mean, you've written the title and the abstract, but not the paper. And then you press complete, and it will just generate a draft of a paper in your voice using your reasons and drawing on the types of, learnings that you've done over the past decade and that's embedded in your previous work. And, you can generate a draft of a paper in, 30 seconds or something like that. So even if you don't like the first draft, you can just generate a second draft by pressing the button again. And then, maybe you sift through the 10 drafts and you decide which one you like. And so this process that would have taken, months and months to come up with a decent first draft of an idea based on just an abstract of the idea can be rapidly moved forward. And we found this very troubling that it was so easy to do this because we're
What's
used
the
to,
point of universities and academia anymore?
well, exactly. So, if you think that the point of universities is just to generate essays, then you think, well, great, large language models make that easier. You just push a button and you generate an essay. Now, I have to say, some of these essays are not of great quality when we tried our little machine. But if you press the button enough times, you can get a draft that's a pretty good draft. And sometimes the draft even has ideas in it that you wouldn't have thought of and that are quite interesting. And in any of these cases, you would have to go and carefully edit it and engage in more work to try to polish it up and so forth. But we were so startled and disturbed by this prospect that we then wrote an essay about the ethics of using large language models to generate essays. So we didn't actually generate this essay. We hand wrote this essay, or I don't know, we typed it out on our keyboards because we really weren't sure about the ethics of it. And so there's now a whole side literature that's developed from this paper we wrote asking about the ethics of using personalized large language models to try to generate new works, whether written works, as in scholarship, or even works of art. So my colleagues and I have recently done a study where we tell participants about this character named Robin, who either makes a painting by hand or makes a painting using one of these large language models where you just type in a prompt, like, you type in a few prompts, make it a painting in this style with this content or whatever, and then it will generate a painting. Or Robin uses a personalized large language model that's been trained on Robin's past paintings that Robin made by hand. And we're just trying to understand what are people's attitudes about this. Do you think that if I use a model that produces a painting, but it's based on my own past paintings, that I still deserve credit as the author of this new painting? Now, if I just use ChatGPT or whatever it's called, Dali, I think is the version of ChatGPT that makes paintings. If I just type in a phrase and then it makes a painting, I sort of feel like I don't really deserve to be the author of that painting. I mean, the model did the work and it's trained on other people's paintings, and I hardly put in anything. I just typed in a few sentences. Nevertheless, I can create this very beautiful seeming work of art. And so I also had that experience. I remember typing into Dolly, make a picture of a girl with big eyes eating a watermelon, I think was the prompt that I put in. And it spat out these various images, and like a couple of them were strikingly beautiful. It was in an oil painting style. And again, I was very disturbed. I was like, I just spent 5 seconds putting in a prompt. And in some sense, using this AI, I created an image which is strikingly beautiful and which I think is like very aesthetically pleasing to look at. But I don't feel like an artist all of a sudden. I mean, I like to paint, but I don't do faces very well. I can paint more like landscapes. So I don't think I'd even be capable of producing this painting if I had wanted to. And so similarly, I was quite disturbed about that, about whether using AI to create things that we normally see as the product of um, creative expression of human beings is going to really disrupt our sense of what does it even mean to be an artist, for example. So anyway, we've been doing some empirical studies to try to understand people's attitudes about that. We've been writing some philosophical papers to try to
Mm.
understand practices of credit and blame when it comes to using AI to
Yeah.
create either beautiful things or harmful things. And so it's a major
I
preoccupation right now.
I
Yeah.
know many professors has just given up on giving essays as a way of assessment in undergraduate levels. Just they just do quizzes now because if it's an essay, they probably assume it's AI written anyway.
Yeah, so an AI can generate an essay that could easily get a good grade in an undergraduate course with minimal effort. And so it's
Mm.
true that, you know, asking students to hand in an essay on some topic, you now have a choice. You can either try to somehow you can use the honor system and hope that they won't use AI, even if you tell them not to, some students will anyway.
Mm.
Or you have to or you have to assume that they're going to use AI and say, um, you should now be writing essays with AI, but you need to hand in your prompt
Mm.
uh, kind of material. So you have to include the logs that you use to create the
Interesting.
essay, and then actually start evaluating them on their creativity and how they use an AI,
Oh
which I sort of think
God.
is where things are heading. Or you have to just have people handwrite essays in class, where you can confirm
Mm.
that they're not using AI. And so next week, I'm actually going on a little retreat with some of my fellow professors here at the National University of Singapore. And we're going to just sit down and think about this exact question. How do we want
Mm.
to handle the issue of AI in
Keep me
undergraduate
posted.
teaching? Yeah, we'll see if we come up with any kind of good solution, but it's truly creating a lot of dilemmas and
Yeah, it is
unclear how to
changing the
proceed.
world very rapidly. I think
Mm,
very few of us feel like we can keep up.
mm, mm.
Well, thank you so much for your time. We've touched on many different exciting, controversial, complex topics. Final, is there any way people can find you if they're interested in your work? What are you currently working on?
Yeah, well,
Yeah,
thank you for your interesting questions. It's pretty easy to find me online. I have you know, a website which is just bryanearp.com and it has links to various papers and things. Most of my papers are available for free on ResearchGate or academia.edu. They're
very
like,
generous of you.
well, they're like the author accepted version, so they're not formatted as nicely as the like final publication, but you can get them there. And Yeah, what am I working on? I'm working on a lot of things. A lot of things have to do with AI. So, working on a book with some colleagues about this personalized AI phenomenon where you create like a digital twin of yourself that can then write essays for you and make paintings for you and do other things for you. And we think it raises a lot of really thorny ethical and philosophical questions. So, we're working on a book length project on that. I'm trying to finish this book I've been working on for many years about the right to bodily integrity and what
Mhm.
that looks like in the case of children, because in adults, it's mostly characterized in terms of consent. Like if I intrude into your bodily sphere without your consent, I've violated your right to bodily integrity. But, a 2-year-old can't consent. They can't give morally valid consent. So what is their right to bodily integrity consist in? I'm working on a book on that topic for many years, and I hope to finish that
Mm.
pretty soon.
Mm.
And yeah, otherwise people can just reach out on email if they want to get a hold of me.
Good. Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for your questions.
No problem. I'll let you know once this is released.
Okay, that's great. Yeah.